On the day my husband died, I said nothing about the $28 million or the skyscraper in New York City that bore my name. I simply stood there quiet, holding the manila folder that held proof of everything they'd assumed was his. That night, while grief still hung in the air like fog, my daughter-in-law's voice cut through it. "Pack your bags. The old leech doesn't stay here." I remember the clatter of her heels, the glint in her eyes that told me this cruelty had been rehearsed. I didn't argue. I just said, "Okay." She thought that was surrender. It wasn't. It was the sound of a storm gathering. My name is Alberta, 64 years old widow of Richard Holloway. For 38 years, I'd loved and cared for him through fortune sickness and silence. The day of his funeral, I thought the hardest part was over. The service was everything Richard would have wanted, dignified, full of friends and associates who spoke of him like a legend. His children from his first marriage, Marcus, Sarah, and David, each said their rehearsed words. Even his ex-wife managed a strained smile. I sat there in my navy dress, the one Richard always said made my eyes look like the sea before a storm, and accepted condolences with quiet grace. But by nightfall, I would discover that grace would no longer be enough. The reception after the funeral took place in what everyone called our house. They didn't realize it hadn't been Richard's for over a decade. I watched them wander through the rooms, whispering about value of the silverware, the art, the furniture, as if my life were an estate sale waiting to happen. Cynthia, my youngest stepson, David's wife, led the pack. She'd always seen me as an obstacle, not family. She wore her black dress like armor and her disdain like perfume. When she said we need to talk about practical matters, I knew the ambush had begun. She spoke of my age of downsizing, of how Richard's success had supported me. Her words sliced through the room. "You never worked, Alberta. This house was Richard's achievement. It's time you moved somewhere more appropriate." I looked at the faces of the children I'd helped raise. Not one of them met my eyes. "Are you telling me to leave?" I asked softly. "We're asking you to be realistic," she said. Then more firmly, "You should pack tonight. David and I will stay here to manage things." I stood in the kitchen where I'd cooked Christmas dinners, patched scraped knees, and held family secrets. And then I said, the only word that mattered, "Okay." The silence that followed was almost comical. They expected tears, pleading, maybe even begging. Instead, I turned back to the dishwasher and kept loading the plates. That night, while they toasted their victory in the living room, I packed 2 suitcases, just 2. I left the jewelry, the designer clothes, the artwork. Let them think I was leaving with nothing. I checked into a Hampton Inn under my maiden name, Alberta Morrison, and paid cash for a week. By morning, I was sitting across from Harold Steinberg, my attorney and confidant of 15 years. "Do they know?" he asked. "Not a clue," I said. "They think Richard handled everything." Harold smiled thinly. "Then they're in for a surprise. Everything's still legally yours, Alberta. The transfers we arranged years ago, every property, every account can be confirmed within 48 hours. I nodded. "Good. Let them settle in first. I want them comfortable before I pull the rug." 2 days later, I drove past the house. Moving trucks lined the driveway. Cynthia was directing them like a general at war, ordering boxes into rooms that no longer belonged to her. My phone buzzed David's message. "Hope you found a nice place. Cynthia's getting Dad's office organized." I almost laughed. The real documents, the ones that mattered, were in a safety deposit box downtown, under my name alone. Let them play house. Their castle was made of glass. At the bank, Margaret Chen, my private banker, greeted me with professional sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Morrison." I handed her the documents Harold had prepared. Her eyes widened. "You wish to initiate transfers of all these assets?" Immediately, I said. As she processed the paperwork, I imagined Cynthia rifling through old folders in Richard's study, finding outdated business files worth less than the wine in our cellar. Within a week, Harold called again. They've hired an attorney. They want a formal reading of the will. Perfect, I said. When Monday, 2 p.m. That weekend I shopped. Not to celebrate, but to prepare. A navy suit, a string of pearls, the Cartier watch Richard had given me on our 10th anniversary. I wanted to look exactly as they remembered, composed, unthreatening, invisible. Monday arrived gray and cool. I walked into the law office 15 minutes early, took a seat, and waited. Through the door, I could hear Cynthia's voice raised in complaint. Why does she even have to be here? She's not a real beneficiary. When the reading began, the air was thick with anticipation. To his children, Marcus, Sarah, and David Richard left $50,000 each. To me, his wife, he left the remainder of his estate, including all properties, investments, and business interests. Silence followed, then outrage. That can't be right, Cynthia snapped. She never worked. I rose slowly, feeling years of silence fall away. You're right, I said. I never contributed to Richard's success. His consulting firm, his modest savings, that was all his. But the house, the properties, the investments you've been whispering about, I paused, letting the tension build. Those were mine. Harold and our associate, Catherine Walsh, began laying documents on the table. Titles, deeds, account records. The house had been transferred to me 15 years earlier. Every major asset was under my name. Cynthia's voice cracked as she read the papers. This can't be real. It's very real, Catherine said. You've been living rent-free in Mrs. Morrison's home. They tried to argue to find logic where none existed. I simply gathered my purse. You have 72 hours to move out, I told them. After that, you're trespassing. Their faces, shock, fury, disbelief were the same expressions I'd worn when they threw me out. Balance, I thought, was a beautiful thing. The first call came 6 hours after the will reading, when the drizzle outside had turned the city into a mirror. I was in my Fairmont suite with a glass of wine I barely tasted when Cynthia's name lit the screen. I let it roll to voicemail and listened to the strain in her voice, confusion about inconsistent paperwork, the sudden politeness that felt like a costume, the offer to clear up misunderstandings. I deleted the message without reply. A second call arrived at 9 p.m., then another at 11 p.m., both more urgent. I slept well for the first time in a week, the steady hush of the vent reminding me that quiet is a privilege you can choose. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the concierge rang to ask whether I would see David in the lobby. I almost told them no, imagining Cynthia beside him with her sharpened eyes, but curiosity is a kind of gravity. David sat on the edge of a low sofa, hands knotted like he'd been holding his breath all night. Without Cynthia's curation, he looked smaller, younger, like the boy who once brought me a wilted dandelion after I'd bandaged his skinned knee. He apologized for the confusion, then for the tone, and finally for the truth. He had stood there while I was pushed from my own kitchen because it felt easier to be a son than a man. I let him talk himself down to silence. When he finally asked what I planned to do, I told him simply that he had until Friday at 6 p.m. to leave my house. After that, the locks would change and a sheriff's notice would follow. He swallowed and nodded like someone preparing to walk across a frozen lake, testing the ice with the heel of his fear. Those 3 days were not an indulgence. They were a mirror. I went about my business like any widow in a careful world, except I had the advantage of not being broke and not being naive. At 10 a.m., I met Harold in a quiet corner of the hotel cafe. He laid out the cadence of what would follow notices, prepared locksmith scheduled a file of photographs documenting the current condition of the house, a meticulous inventory of what I had left behind and would not grieve losing. He asked how I was sleeping. I told him the truth deeply, but with a light at the edge of every dream, as if dawn had stationed itself right behind my eyelids. He smiled at that and slid across the table a crisp folder of confirmations. Seeing my name repeat across pages with the steadiness of a heartbeat steadied me more than any drink could. Cynthia's messages changed flavor by that afternoon. At 2 p.m., she demanded clarifications, as if she could requisition reality. At 4 p.m., she offered mediation. By 7 p.m., she made the mistake people make when they realize the door is closing. She tried to play family. "We can work something out," she said. "You don't want to make enemies." I answered that making enemies had never been my hobby, but keeping promises was, and I had promised to change the locks on Friday at 6 p.m. There was breathing on the other end, then a click, and the kind of silence that isn't empty at all, but full of what people can't yet say. Friday arrived clear and cold, the kind of afternoon that keeps its own counsel. At 5:20 p.m., I drove to the house with the locksmith following in a van that hummed like a patient animal. The driveway was a mosaic of cars. Through the window, I could see figures moving at the speed of panic. I used my key because it felt right to use something literal after so much theater. The living room snapped into silence when the door opened. Cynthia stood near the mantel as if marble could confer authority. Marcus flanked her with his arms folded. Sarah's mouth was a white line of math that refused to add up. David was by the window again, as if glass could translate him into someone else. I greeted them with a warmth I actually felt. Distance, I've learned, is not the opposite of kindness. Cynthia began with settlement, a word that fluttered around the room like a trapped bird. She spoke of sweat equity and emotional investment, of what they had put into the home, as if volume could draft a contract. I told her she had lived here rent-free for days, and that emotion is not a currency the court recognizes. She rallied, and that was when two strangers on the sofa rose like a reluctant confession. Cynthia introduced them as her parents, Tom and Linda Patterson. They offered the flustered welcome of people who had been given a story and were shocked to find themselves inside a different plot. When I explained carefully that the house had been mine for 15 years and that their daughter's performance in my kitchen on the night of the funeral had been precisely as cruel as they were imagining, Tom's face passed from confusion into embarrassment so quickly I almost pitied him. He apologized the way a father apologizes when he still believes words can undo facts. Linda looked at her daughter and asked a question no one had bothered to ask me that night. "Why did you do this?" Cynthia opened her mouth and found no air. The Pattersons left with an apology that felt like a small repair in a long road. At 5:58 p.m., I checked the time and told them they had 2 minutes to carry out what remained. Marcus grabbed a final box. Sarah took a framed photograph of her own child and nothing else. David lifted 2 bags and lowered his eyes. Cynthia stood without moving, a statue built of the wrong stone. "This isn't over," she said, and I agreed in the only way that mattered. For me, it is. At 6 p.m., the locksmith began and the tumblers turned with the calm music of consequence. In the golden edge of evening, a simple thing happened. My house became my home again, not because a lock is magic, but because a boundary had finally learned to speak. When they were gone, the rooms exhaled. Dust motes swam in the last light, as if the air were remembering how to be beautiful. In the quiet, I walked through each space, slowly touching the backs of chairs and the cool rims of picture frames, not to claim them. I had owned these things all along, but to honor them. Ownership is paperwork. Stewardship is posture. In the kitchen, I set the kettle on at 6:20 p.m. and leaned against the counter where I had stood the night they exiled me. The whistle rose soft and certain, and I poured the water like a blessing into a cup I thought I didn't need anymore. 6 months passed before the past knocked again. By then, peace had grown roots in my life. Mornings began with coffee on the veranda, the roses always greedy for sunlight. I'd stopped checking my phone first thing. The house, once heavy with ghosts of conversations, now held the gentle silence of freedom. So when the call came at 8:30 a.m. from Mercy General Hospital, I almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Dr. Chen. We have a patient asking for you, David Holloway. You're listed as his emergency contact." For a moment, the name hung between us like dust caught in light. "What happened?" I asked. "Car accident. He's stable, but he wants to see you. I was in the hospital 20 minutes later, my pulse steady in a way it hadn't been in years." David looked fragile, one arm in a sling, his leg in a cast eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "You came," he said quietly. "Of course I did," I replied. The words came without effort, though the history between us filled the room. "They couldn't reach Cynthia," he added, trying to sound casual. "Her phone's disconnected." I wasn't surprised. Word in town was that she'd packed up months ago, leaving behind an unpaid credit line and a trail of bitterness. "She said she married me for the lifestyle, not for me," he said with a hollow laugh. I sat beside him studying the face of the man I'd helped raise. He looked older than 35, but somehow younger too, like a boy who'd finally run out of places to hide. "I need to tell you something," he said after a long pause. "That night, when Cynthia threw you out, I knew it was wrong. I should have stopped it." His voice cracked, but I was angry about the will about everything. I let her convince me you were the problem. Tears slipped down his cheeks, and for the first time I saw, not arrogance, but regret. "You raised me, Alberta. You taught me to drive, to be decent, and I stood there while my wife called you names." He wiped at his eyes clumsily with his good hand. "I can't undo what I did, but I needed you to know I remember who you really are." I reached for his hand. It felt small in mine like it had when he was 12. "You didn't throw me away," I said softly. "You made a terrible mistake, but not an unforgivable one." He stared at me, disbelief flickering through the tears. "How can you say that after everything I thought about it for a moment? Because that night I lost more than a home. I lost an illusion that we were a family built on love. The truth was, our bond was built on convenience and assumptions. You all saw me as what I provided, not who I was." He nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Now," I continued, "you're seeing me for the first time, not as someone's wife or your stepmother or a source of money, just as me. And I'm seeing you clearly, too, as a man trying to do better." He exhaled long and shaky. "So where does that leave us?" "It leaves us here," I said, "starting over if we choose. But it has to be real this time, built on honesty, not obligation." His lips trembled into the smallest smile. "You'd give me that chance. I'd give us that chance," I said. "But I won't rescue you. Not from guilt, not from hardship. You'll build your life yourself now. Independence suits you." As I stood to leave, he caught my hand again. "What about Marcus and Sarah?" "That's up to them," I said. "My door is open, but they'll have to walk through it themselves." He hesitated. "And Cynthia?" I paused at the doorway. "Some lessons are meant to last a lifetime. Hers will." Outside, the air smelled of antiseptic and rain. For the first time, I didn't feel like a woman who'd lost everything. I felt like someone who had reclaimed what mattered, the right to choose peace over revenge. That evening, I sat in my garden again. My phone buzzed with 2 new voicemails, Marcus and Sarah. Apologies, tentative and uncertain. I didn't call back. Not yet. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a door you fling open. It's a window you crack slowly when the air feels safe again. As the sun sank light pooling gold over the roses, I realized I'd won something far greater than wealth or vindication. I'd won myself back, the woman who had once built quietly, who had once been underestimated, who now stood entirely on her own. The invisible widow was gone forever. In her place stood someone who knew her worth down to the last breath, someone who could choose when to open her heart and when to guard it. And that, I thought, as night gathered softly around me, was worth more than $47 million. Though I smiled to myself, the $47 million certainly didn't hurt. If Alberta's story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how power, grace, and quiet strength can rewrite any ending. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place?